right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 88 of the Breaking Balls podcast, the Dale Jr. episode, or Dale Jarrett, I don't judge, whichever you want to choose. After 6 long hours at Loudon, we finally have a winner, Christopher Bell, rain-soaked and all, wins and sweeps the weekend. We've got a lot to break down as far as the rain tires and NASCAR finally letting them loose, and Kyle Larson and his spotter had an interesting exchange on the radio. We're going to break it all down.
Flags in the air. Boogity, boogity, boogity. Let's go racing, boys.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 88 of the Breaking Balls podcast. I'm your host today, Adam O'Shea. My co-host, Bob Perry, is out exploring the Rocky Mountains. But if you're new here, make sure you subscribe. We cover NASCAR on a weekly basis here. We're just, like to get a raw reaction to the race every Sunday, and then we break down all the news that happens throughout the week. Make sure you give us a subscription. We'll make it worth your time, I promise. Whew. Speaking of making things worth your time, NASCAR, as much as we talk a lot about all the things that they do wrong, every now and again they get something so right that everybody just kind of has to tip the old cap. And today feels like one of those days for race fans. Let's not bury the lead here. Christopher Bell won today at Loudon. Like I said in the intro, he sweeps the weekend. He won yesterday in the Xfinity race. He won the pre-weekend press conference, which we'll get into a little bit later. But, third win of the year for Christopher Bell. Ultimately won a rain-shortened Coke 600. I believe it was the Coke 373.5 we called it on this podcast, because NASCAR wouldn't use their rain tires. But today we have done a full 180, and as soon as the rain started falling, I think every NASCAR fan, including myself, said, you know what? They're going to call it. They called a crown jewel race. It was the Coke 600. They called that race because of, we weren't able to drive the track, da-da-da-da-da. Even though it seemed like they had the ability to. And, ultimately it seems as if today they proved to us fans that they learned from their past mistakes. I mean, they did everything they possibly could to continue this race. They basically, they left the cars on pit road, said, hey, cover them. We're going to see what we can do and throw rain tires on. And sure enough, as soon as the weather let up, we had the opportunity and NASCAR acted. And they said, hey, put the rain tires on. We're going to dry this track and we're going to do this thing. Like I said, I was of the belief that we weren't going to do it. And, I was going to have to come on this podcast and talk about what a brilliant strategy play Tyler Reddick and his crew chief, the boys at 2311, put together by, keeping him out and having him hold the track position the way he did in stage 3 with the rain, coming. We all knew it was going to happen. I, for all intents and purposes, thought Tyler Reddick had this race in the bag. As soon as I saw the red flag drop, I thought, okay, cool. I can go upstairs, record the podcast. No big deal. But sure enough, NASCAR, just when you think that you know exactly what they're going to do, they throw a curveball at you. And this was probably the best curveball that any race fan can ask for, especially for those people who were in the grandstands in Loudon today. NASCAR usually, with a few exceptions, goes to tracks once a year. This is obviously a once-a-year track with, in New Hampshire. And these race fans, man, we talk a lot about, the rowdy fans and stuff like that. We don't talk about the good people in New Hampshire enough, because these race fans are some of the nicest people that we encounter as far as the sport traveling throughout, all the different places that they go. You hear nothing but good things about the fans at Loudon, and they deserved this today. I mean, the way that they were able to just finish. I mean, the importance of just seeing the race come down to what is happening on the track. I think it's so important. And, I just have you, like I said, you have to tip your cap to NASCAR, because if you're going to put the money into investing in these rain tires and really making these things work, you got to get data points. You got to run them. You got to actually take the risk and say, you know what, we're going to do this. And that's exactly what they did today. And was it as clean as it necessarily could be? Absolutely not. I think, I hate the way that they took it out of the team's hands and kind of said, okay, here's your tires. You're not going to be allowed to change them at any point. That was the only part of this I really didn't like, because ultimately, you're paying these crew chiefs and these drivers a lot of money. Let them make the decisions as to what they are going to do or not do with their car. I think, you've done everything you can as far as a sanctioning body with this next gen car to make them basically, you know, as a level of a playing field as you can. The only thing we have left in this sport that really creates parity is the decisions made by the teams. So I will say that is the one criticism I have of this move, is that it did feel like it was very much taking, you know, the decisions that would allow people to win this race out of their hands. I think Kyle Larson will have a gripe because of the way that he scrubbed his tire, and he thought he didn't have anything left and he wasn't able to put a new tire on. And, I think there will be a lot to be said about that eventually once the dust settles. But I think we're all kind of riding this high of, we finished a race that, 2-3 years ago, we would have had no opportunity to even consider finishing. And I think that's something that you have to, you got to take the little victories when we get them. And this feels like a little victory for us fans who, we don't have that existential dread every single time you see rain in the forecast, because NASCAR has finally showed us, hey, look, we've got a counter for this. If we can get the track dry enough, we've got these rain tires, and we can make this race work. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. But I'll say this, it was very interesting to watch these drivers have to go, all the way down to the apron, in some instances, even in the grass to keep the tires cool, all the way up to the top of the racetrack, looking for grip, looking for speed anywhere. And it was just very intriguing. Even though it may not be what we're, necessarily used to, it was so interesting to see these cars run, 3-4 wide consistently, just looking for grip, looking for dry parts of the racetrack. And it was a little bizarre to see, when they weren't able to change the race tires the rain tires once the track was starting to dry, just the way that guys had to really go towards the bottom of the racetrack to keep those tires wet and to kind of keep the treads on them. It just opened up this entire, this new wrinkle that really, it just made the race so intriguing to me. And, ultimately it doesn't surprise me that a guy like Christopher Bell won this race, because, you heard the broadcasters harp on it. The guys with dirt track backgrounds are just used to having to look for new lines in basically every single corner, because when you're running on a dirt track, the tracks change consistently. There's no such thing as this is what I do in, turns 1 and 2, turns 3 and 4, like you do on asphalt racing. You constantly have to be looking for something new, a new line, a new way to gain speed. Wherever your car is fastest, that's where you got to put it. And it felt like that type of race today, which really made it no surprise to me that Christopher Bell did end up winning. We may as well get into some of the results. I mean, like I said, the guy who was most disappointed after this whole thing is Tyler Reddick. Led 53 laps today, ultimately had the lead when the red flag dropped. And like I've said, in the past, that would have been enough. He gave himself, he would just, I'll say, the way that he was able to, on way older tires, just hold off the field basically in stage 3 and find a way, with all of the different restarts, because Lord knows we had a million different cautions in this race, whether or not it was on the rain tires or the slicks, we were going to have cautions. I mean, shoot, it felt like guys like Kyle Busch and Corey LaJoie were, spinning backwards more than they were, going forward this race. But, you do have to give a ton of credit to Tyler Reddick for even trying it and even being able to hold on a little bit. Ultimately, when the rain tires came on, he just wasn't able to hold on, but still a pretty good day for him. I think he ultimately ended up finishing, where it couldn't have been too far. Yeah, it was 6th place, so obviously not the day that he thought he was going to have when the red flag came out, but ultimately still a top 10 finish. A really good day. Another guy who had a really good day and has been kind of stringing them together is Todd Gilliland. My co-host would be remiss if I didn't mention Todd Gilliland, especially this early in the podcast. Leading laps today. Led 19 laps, looked really good in the green pickle car. I thought that was an awesome sponsorship. I loved the way that it popped off the screen a little bit with that color. But it was very you he was very realistic about his day. They interviewed him during the red flag and basically was like, look, do I think we necessarily have some of the speed to hang out with the top cars? No. He goes, but you never know what can happen. And got to give him a ton of credit for kind of hanging in. Ultimately, didn't finish in the top 10. I think ended up finishing around 12th, but still a very good day, for a guy who is really starting to put together some pretty solid finishes at the Cup Series level. I think front row's got a heck of a talent there. It'll be interesting to see him continue to gain confidence through the year. I think if you're buying stock, there seems to be a guy that would be a pretty interesting investment at this point. Another guy who I think is a very interesting investment, especially given everything going on at SHR right now, is Josh Berry. Josh Berry had a heck of a day. I don't think he led any laps in this race, but was up towards the front the entire time. He always seemed to be just sniffing around the action towards the front there, which is kind of what you expect out of him. These types of tracks, these short to intermediate tracks are his bread and butter. But ultimately, you still have to perform when you show up. Just because you have the pedigree to do something doesn't mean you do it. And ultimately, he showed up and performed today. He had a pretty good day. I think anytime you can get that, what's with everything that's been going on at SHR, anytime you can get two of your cars in the top 5, that's a pretty good day. And we should talk about the second car who finished in the top 5 for SHR, and that's Chase Briscoe. I mentioned it in the intro. Christopher Bell kind of let the cat out of the bag and basically said, oh, hey, when Chase comes aboard next year. And, other than Kyle Larson, I don't think anybody else made made any bones about which Chase we were talking about. It was very clear it was Chase Briscoe. And, my co-host and I will talk a little bit more about, that move of Chase Briscoe to JGR once it's officially announced. But as far as what he did today, like I said, no surprise that a guy with a dirt track background like Chase Briscoe had success once these rain tires came on, because ultimately everybody was looking for grip, and he was able to find it, especially late in the race. Just found a way to piece it together. I think towards the end there, I think everybody was just real. It was so scrappy because of all of the different cautions and stuff. It doesn't surprise it does surprise me a little bit to see where he finished, but ultimately on a day like today, when everything was surprising, you just kind of have to say, yeah, why not? Chase Briscoe can finish second. I mean, let's face facts. Harrison Burton finished in the top 15 today, so I don't know. My mind's in a little bit of a blender, and I think anybody who follows this podcast knows I'm a bit of a Michael McDowell fan. So the fact that my head's going to hit the pillow tonight, knowing that Harrison Burton finished ahead of my boy Michael McDowell, I'm not going to sleep very well. We'll leave it at that. But I guess another ultimately a guy that we need to talk about because of how much success he had in the beginning portion of this race. The time of this race where we did run on slicks was Denny Hamlin. I mean, he ended up leading 43 laps. Looked like he had a very strong car. But my, oh my, as soon as those rain tires came on, it just seemed like he had absolutely nothing. Just kind of sunk like a rock towards the bottom of the field. I mean, it was so interesting because it was a car that very clearly had speed, and he ends up with a 24th place finish. I mean, just kind of wild, all things considered. Another guy who kind of had a similar type day was Ryan Blaney, guy who was really fighting for the win. Felt like he was perennially in second place for the majority of this race. Ends up finishing 25th. It just goes to show you when these drivers have so little data points and so, and their crew chiefs have so little of an understanding of what's going on with these rain tires, just about anything can happen. And that's kind of what did, to be dead honest with you. It was just a very interesting day for a lot of different guys, a lot of different reasons. It wouldn't be the Breaking Balls podcast if we didn't bring up, and when I say we, I mean me today, because my co-host left me hanging. I'm pretty sad about it. I'm not going to lie. But anyway, he would be remiss if I didn't mention Justin Haley. Have a day, fella. I mean, obviously another guy who kind of falls in the category of not necessarily getting the result he deserved, finishing 29th, but was in the top 10. I mean, when that red flag came out, he was in the top 5. I mean, it just seemed like he was a little, one or two little moves away from really having a good day, and just ultimately couldn't hold it together, you know. And speaking of a guy who just can't hold it together right now, the gentleman behind the wheel of the number 8 Chevrolet for Richard Childress Racing, Kyle Busch, my oh my. When it rains, it pours. No pun intended, but pun definitely intended. This is, I think, the 5th just god awful week for Kyle Busch. I mean, it seems like anything that can go wrong is going wrong. Like I said, I think he ended up spinning around 3 or 4 different times in this race. It just doesn't seem like there's something off. Obviously, I would venture to say it's more on the performance side at RCR than it is with Kyle Busch's driving, but at this point, they've had such a lack of success for so many, for 5 straight weeks at this point. Nobody knows who to point the finger at, myself included, but it's something to keep an eye on because, you're starting to hear, the media kind of stir the pot a little bit. I think there was a question that, Kyle Busch answered this week about, oh, hey, what would a potential JGR reunion look like for you? And Kyle Busch, you got to credit him because he's always honest, but I don't think I'd have answered that as honestly as he did, basically saying, well, yeah, I mean, if, one day, if that happens, yeah, and he kind of tried to make it seem more broad by saying, yeah, if Hendrick offered me to come back, I'd consider going back. If JGR, offered me to go back, I'd consider it. But it doesn't bode well. I mean, if you're Richard Childress and you're hearing that quote, it's got to make you pause just a little bit. I mean, you've got, a pretty large investment in it in Kyle Busch at this point. Ultimately, things haven't gone to plan, but I'll say this, it does feel like he's kind of getting ready to find a way to abandon ship a little bit. And you can't blame him because this is a guy who's very used to running, in the top 10, top 5, and to just so consistently not get results. It's just, I can only imagine the, where Kyle Busch is at mentally with everything going on. Especially he has shown us over the years, pretty easy to frustrate him. Gets very frustrated when he's not performing on the racetrack, and I don't know. It's something to keep an eye on because today certainly didn't help the narrative of, Kyle Busch generally, because I think everybody's got this negative taste in their mouth because he just can't get a result right now. I think it's crazy. I guess we'll stack some pennies and talk a little bit about Corey LaJoie because in a very similar way, he just was backwards and around more times than he was. It seemed like anytime we were looking at Corey LaJoie's car today, it was because it was spinning and causing a caution. I think between Kyle Busch and Corey LaJoie, there had to have accounted for at least 40% of the cautions that happened today. But, it's always been a big what if, but I think Corey LaJoie is kind of showing us his true colors a little bit. It just feels like there's, I don't know. If you keep spinning like you have been, if you keep, it just seems like he's pushing at this point. He's very clearly getting outrun by his teammates on a pretty consistent basis. We've talked about it, a lot on this podcast, but at this point, I just don't know how you move forward. I don't know even, what do you even do to really kind of improve in that instance? It beats me, but you got to be honest about what you see. At this point, it's been nothing but a struggle for Corey LaJoie, and real shame because he's a very likable guy, but gotta get those results in order to keep your job. It'll be interesting to see what they're gonna do over there. I guess we can transition to a little bit off the track now. I feel so weird because I keep saying we, and I'm just not built for this solo podcast game. I'll tell you that much. But big off the track news. We saw a lot of it early in the week. Congratulations to Daniel Suarez for passing his citizenship test. Welcome. you're kind of getting in at the end of the empire, but we won't talk politics on this podcast. But I still think I mentioned it earlier. With Christopher Bell letting the cat out of the bag that Chase Briscoe is likely going to JGR. I may as well give you my opinion now. It's interesting. I think Chase Briscoe has, for what he brings in sponsorship money, he may lack a touch in talent, or at least what he has shown at the Cup Series. But that being said, I think we all can agree that SHR hasn't necessarily been the most stable or consistent home. For a lot of different reasons, it just seems like, I think you've heard Kevin Harvick's comments where he was like, we spent 1 week at Hendrick and saw Mr. Hendrick more times than he saw, either Tony Stewart or Gene Haas while he was at Stewart Haas. Who knows? I think, a breath of fresh air, new manufacturer. I think this is the type of change that if we were going to spur Chase Briscoe into success, this is the type of change that does it. Because it's a complete change of scenery. Obviously this is brought on because he has the money to bring to the team. And I think, ultimately that's huge. If you have backing, if you have sponsorship, you will generally have a ride in the NASCAR Cup Series. And, this kind of furthers that narrative because obviously with the Mahindra partnership that, has basically said they'll follow Chase Briscoe wherever he goes, it does seem like this is a good match. I'm very interested to see how he fits in the stable of drivers there at Joe Gibbs. But, I'm sure my co-host will have opinions on this when he returns from his Rocky Mountain retreat. So we will have to, I'm sure this will be something that ends up coming up again. And, well, since that silly season domino fell, we may as well talk about the other one that fell this week. The big announcement that Gene Haas has decided he's going to retain one charter for the Cup Series, keep 2 Xfinity seats. I didn't have this one on my bingo card. I thought it was both Tony Stewart and Gene Haas that wanted out of NASCAR, and it turns out it may have just been Tony Stewart, which you can read into all you want. I'll give you my opinion. I think this is something that you kind of have to look into the charter negotiations. I think obviously, Tony Stewart and NASCAR have had we'll call it a strained relationship. Definitely haven't seen eye to eye on everything in the past. But with all of the things going on with the charter negotiations, I think it's a really interesting tell that Tony Stewart wants out. I don't know exactly what it says, but I do think Tony Stewart kind of taking his ball and going home should signal that these negotiations may not be going as smoothly as us fans would like to believe that they are. But ultimately, I think as far as Gene Haas goes, having Gene Haas in the sport is obviously a good thing. It would have been a little bit of a shot for him to say, oh, well, I'm just going to give up my presence in NASCAR and focus completely on F1. I think if that would have happened, it just doesn't feel right. It just feels like, oh, well, if we're supposed to be, if F1 is kind of supposed to be NASCAR's competitor, and one of the owners basically just completely gave up on one and went to the other, it does say something about both series. But I do think having Gene Haas still around the sport is a good thing. I'm interested to see how competitive the team will be, who's going to drive the car. I know Cole Custer's dad is going to stay on, and kind of be the director of competition. So, writing seems to be on the wall there. You have to assume it's probably going to be Cole Custer in that seat, but it's another silly season domino to fall. We've had a lot of them fall in the past little bit here. We understand where Chase Briscoe's going. Martin Truex is retiring. We got a lot to break down here in the future. There's a lot of rumors that will probably come out, a lot of things that we're going to discuss, and don't worry, we will cover them all here on the Breaking Balls podcast. If you're still listening to this point of roughly 25 minutes of me talking to myself, God bless you. And I promise this is better when there's both Bob and I. So if you liked this, make sure you hit like, comment, let me know where I was wrong, subscribe to the podcast and, the YouTube channel. Like I said, we cover NASCAR on a weekly basis. When stories drop, we tend to put out videos pretty quickly on, our opinions, just talking about what's going on. And ultimately, to sum up Loudon, it was long, it was wet. There was a lot of things that happened that I never thought I would see on a NASCAR track, including running in the rain. Even if we had the rain tire, it felt like it was just never going to happen. But we did it. And ultimately, I think when you look back on today, it will be a historic day in the sport that showed, look, we can run in the rain. And I think that's so cool because it felt like, we've heard the old adage, if you want rain, bring NASCAR into town and they'll bring the rain with them, I promise. So for NASCAR to be, proactive in developing this tire, I think is an awesome thing. To see it work, even with some of the kinks that we talked about, or I talked about earlier in the episode, I'm just interested to see moving forward how much how much this changes things as far as being able to finish races and not having to have these finishes under red flags. I think that's going to be it for me, folks. So, this is usually the point of the show where Bob goes on a little bit of a rant and then tells me I get the last word. So I'm just going to act like that's happening. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Lobster.